Hello, everyone, and welcome back to American Ultras Talk. January is here, which means it's time for everyone's favorite USMNT camp, Camp Cupcake. A USMNT D team comprised of almost exclusively MLS players will take on Venezuela on January 18th and CONCACAF rivals Costa Rica on January 22nd. It's been reported that the group will meet in Florida on the 7th, so we thought now would be a good time to put out a roster prediction. It's been said that around 28 players will reportedly be in the camp, but we've gone with just 26 for the sake of simplicity, since that's the normal roster size for a competition. Keep in mind that it is not a FIFA window, so teams can decline to release their players. Pochettino did say that he expects the commitment of all MLS teams to release their guys, despite some instances in the past where teams have not released their players for U.S. teams, specifically the Olympics, looking at you, Chicago Fire. But for this scenario, we have assumed that all MLS teams will comply with the USMNT and Pochettino and let their players go be part of the camp. Now, because it's not a FIFA window and because most of the European competitions and teams will be competing in their respective leagues during this time, obviously we cannot have most of our main players, which opens the door for some young prospects, maybe some MLS lifers, players who've been playing well domestically, and a couple outside of the box shouts. So without further ado, let's just get into the roster prediction with the three goalkeepers. Now, this one is probably the most straightforward of the positions. You have Patrick Schulte of the Columbus Crew, who's not only going to be probably the starter in this camp, but is also a contender for the USMNT #1, of course, backing up Matt Turner for the main national team. But with Matt Turner not getting any minutes, Schulte could potentially be on the move to Europe. I think that would help him a lot. But for now, Schulte is the goalkeeper who I think will start probably both matches. I do hope they give a match to somebody else just for the sake of experimentation and giving other people a chance, but Schulte is definitely the leading contender to start both games, and I think it's without a doubt that he will be in this camp. Next up, I've gone for Chris Brady, the Chicago Fire's youngster, still just 20 years old. He's been starting for the Fire for a couple seasons now. Isn't necessarily the best goalkeeper in MLS. He's around middle of the pack, but only being 20, he has such a bright future ahead of him. Just missed out on an Olympic spot over the summer, and I think now is a good time to bring him into a USMNT camp. He probably won't play, but I think it's better than any other option. I'd rather bring a young guy than bring an experienced veteran, especially considering that they're not going to play. Get him involved with the group and see how he does in training. Now, for the third spot, I've gone with probably the best American goalkeeper in MLS. And no, it is not Zach Steffen, contrary to what Pochettino and Rapids fans believe. I've gone for Matt Fries of NYCFC. Obviously, you guys know I'm a Union fan. When he was backing up Andre Blake, I always thought he was absolute quality. He went to NYCFC a couple seasons ago to become their full-time starter, and he has been excellent for them, most notably in the shootout in the playoffs this year to knock out FC Cincinnati. He's been so good. I think one of the best goalkeepers, not just American, in all of MLS, and has more than deserved a call up, I would argue, to the main USMNT, considering the goalkeeper options we have. But this is the perfect opportunity for him to get a chance and impress Pochettino and maybe sneak into the roster. If he can outperform Schulte in this camp, then I think he has a pretty decent chance, considering we're also bringing Zach Steffen, Ethan Horvath, goalkeepers like this to the main USMNT. Now, I do want to say one thing. Obviously, I think I've already explained why Zach Steffen is not here in my prediction, even though, sadly, I do think he will be in the real camp. I'm not bringing Diego Cochin. I think some other people who have put out predictions are bringing him. #1, I don't think Barcelona will release him because it's an official window, not an official window, sorry, for FIFA. So teams in Europe and I guess teams in MLS as well don't have to release their players. I don't think Barca will. He's their starter for their B team, Barça Athletic, in the third tier of Spain, and they do have games during the winter that we will have games as well for the USMNT, so I just don't think he'll be released. And there's also a USA U20 camp at the same time, which is why you'll see most of the U20 players not in my roster prediction, even the domestic-based ones. I think it's probably better for them to be with the U20s ahead of the World Cup coming up this year, and probably they're not at the level to be in this camp anyway. Now, those are the three goalkeepers. Let's move on to the fullbacks. And I'll start out on the right-hand side with a Philadelphia Union player, a player who started for us in the Olympics. I'm going for Nathan Harriel, still just 23. He's been pretty solid for the Union for several seasons now as the starting right back, mixing it up with Mbaizo on the right-hand side. And I think it just makes sense to bring him. He started for the Olympics. Despite that one bad game against Morocco, outside of that, he was largely a solid player, at least in the group stage for us. So I think it just makes the most sense to bring him. And for the other right back, this was actually a tough one. There's a lot of options, a lot of kind of mid options. I would have liked to have brought Brooks Lennon from Atlanta United, but he is injured, long-term injury. He's out for several months now, unfortunately. I do think he is the best American right back in MLS, but without him, I decided to bring Julian Gressel. Now, he's been with the USMNT in the past, most notably in the Gold Cup in 2023, and I think he just offers versatility. He can play in the midfield, he can play as a winger, he can play as a right back, and as a backup option, versatility is great to have, and he's an older, more experienced player who knows what it takes to be part of the USMNT, kind of, at least part of a USMNT backup group, and he's well experienced in MLS. He's won the championship multiple times, I believe, so I think he's the perfect guy for the locker room to help some of these younger players. Now, on the left-hand side, the starter, at least, is a very obvious choice, John Tolkien. Now, I will say for Tolkien, and I guess this goes for some of the other players later down the line as well, if they do end up making a transfer to Europe, some kind of like James Sands just did, he would have been in the roster probably, but if they make a transfer to Europe in this January window, they probably won't be in the roster, and that's overall better for their career anyway. But I'm just going to assume that no other transfers happen, even though they probably will. It just makes it easier to predict the roster. So John Tolkien as the starting left back. Again, like Harriel, he started throughout the Olympics. He was very solid. I think one of our most underrated players during that tournament, even one of our best. And I think he's more than ready for a move to Europe himself. We talked about that in the MLS players who need transfers abroad video that came out a couple of weeks ago. Go watch that if you haven't. But Tolkien should be the starter for both of these games. As the backup, I went a little bit outside of the box for a player that some of you guys probably won't know. I went for Max Arfston from the Columbus Crew. He's both-footed. He can play on either side, and honestly, he's been really good. Also, just 23 years old. It kind of came out of an unconventional path. Wasn't really notable as a youth player, which is why a lot of people might not know him, but he was instrumental in the Columbus Crew in this incredible season they just had, and I think it's worth it to bring a more younger player rather than someone like Daewon Jones, also from the Columbus Crew, who's older, more experienced, doesn't really have the upside anymore, or someone like even George Bello, who plays in Austria, yes, abroad, but their season runs a little longer, so it's possible that he could be an option. And of course, there's also Peyton Miller, the youngster from the New England Revolution. I think he'll be with the U20s, which is why I don't have him here. I think that's probably a better spot for him, at least right now. Now, on to the center backs, and I decided to bring 5 of them. And I think this is actually one of the positions where we're most spoiled for choice in terms of at least the quality of players regarding the rest of the roster. Obviously, in general, they're not that great, but there's a lot of decent options that could be contenders for this camp. I'll start with the obvious one, Tim Ream. He's the USMNT captain. I fully expect him to be in this camp. It just makes the most sense. He's playing for Charlotte FC in MLS. He's the perfect guy to help the new guys come in and learn the USMNT system, learn what it means to be a USMNT player, and then hopefully for some of the younger guys, coach them up, and maybe they'll be USMNT players one day. That is really the goal. If we don't get any future USMNT players out of this, the camp's kind of for nothing. It's just hyping up all of the mid-MLS players, which is why I don't have Miles Robinson or Walker Zimmerman in the roster. I don't think it's worth it to see either of these guys, especially since Jackson Reagan, who I do have in the roster, has been better than both of them in MLS, a nominee for Defender of the Year, the only American nominated for that award. Reagan from the Seattle Sounders had an excellent year. He's still relatively young at 26 years old for a center back. That's still decently young, not even in his prime yet. I think it's worth it to give him a look. He's been, I think, pretty underrated for a couple seasons now. He even got rumored for a move to Europe last summer, so we'll see what happens there, but I think he's definitely more than deserving to be in this camp. Next up, I went for Andrew Privet, Tim Ream's teammate at Charlotte FC, one of the best young defenders in MLS at 24 years old. As a center back, was part of Charlotte FC, who I think probably had the best defense in MLS, at least up there, definitely top 5, and He is, again, another player who's probably not as well known because he's kind of just emerged out of nowhere this past 2 seasons, but he really came into his own this year, was, I think, a very solid player, held his own with Adilson Malanda, Charlotte's star center back, who's from France and has been continuously linked to a move to Europe, and of course Tim Ream now part of the fold. I think it's worth it to give Andrew Privet a look. Also, Jalen Neal as the fourth center back. I think this one kind of speaks for itself. He's really the only young center back in MLS, at least from an American perspective, that has been on the radar consistently. He's been pretty solid for the USMNT when getting a look, particularly in the Gold Cup in 2023. He's actually got his first USMNT appearance before his first Galaxy appearance, which was very interesting back in, I believe, 2022. But I think it makes the most sense to bring him in here. He's really the only young center back prospect that we have, at least for now, which brings me to my fifth center back, which is Fernando Alvarez, a name who might be unfamiliar to some. He's a center back, a tri-national with Mexico and Colombia. He's 21 years old, and he plays for CF Montreal in MLS, which is not necessarily a typical destination for Americans, considering that they are a Canadian team. But in MLS, it has been reported that the Federation has been talking to him about a potential switch. He has represented Colombia's U23s and U20s in official competitions, so he would need a one-time switch. But if we're going to be realistic, he's probably not getting into the Colombia team at any point, and I think he is a very intriguing option to have. So I'm choosing to be optimistic here and saying that he will be part of the team. Now, on to the midfielders, and we'll start with the two CDMs. I've gone with Edwin Cerrillo from LA Galaxy. Was very instrumental in that Galaxy team that, of course, won the MLS Championship, MLS Cup this year. I think he had a very good season, and you have to reward players who had good seasons in MLS. That's what this camp is all about. I think he's earned it with his play domestically. Still only 24 years old as well, so on the relatively young side, at least for footballers. Especially considering some of the alternative options like Kellen Acosta. So I think he deserves a look. And for the other CDM, I went for a player who actually played against him in the MLS Cup final. I went for Daniel Edelman from the New York Red Bulls, was our U20 captain at the U20 World Cup last year, and is still so young at 21 years old, has been a key starter for the New York Red Bulls the entire season, instrumental to their run as well, their underdog run to the MLS Cup final. I think he's more than deserved a look. Do I think he'll be a USMNT player in the future? Probably not, considering our depth at the position. Like I said earlier, James Sands probably would have been here if he didn't make the move to the Bundesliga, but I think he's definitely deserving of a look in this camp. Some other options are, of course, Noah Buck, who is rejoining the Revolution after his loan at Southampton ended. If he is willing to make the one-time switch from England, since he has fallen out of favor with their youth teams, that is worth exploring, although I don't think he'd be able to make that a decision on his international future this quickly. I just don't think it makes sense from his perspective, but it would be a nice option to have. Another one that I think is a little bit outside of the box that I wouldn't mind seeing is Emeka Anelli from the Real Salt Lake. Had a very good season at CDM and right back, so a little bit of versatility there. But on to the eights, the center midfielders. I picked three of them, and the midfield is definitely the most stacked of this area as you push further up the pitch. I'm going to start with a Union player, Jack McGlynn. I think he's one of the key names in this camp, will absolutely be there. Was actually in the last camp Cupcake as well, looked very good off the bench. He had a breakout season of sorts for the Philadelphia Union this year. Despite the team struggles, he was one of the key players. 4 goals, 8 assists in all competitions, and I expect him to be hopefully a starter and one of the best players on this team as he pushes for a move to Europe himself. Next up, I have Cole Bassett, a player who I think was severely underrated this season in MLS. Unfortunately, did get injured towards the end of the year, but he will be back now, made his return towards the end of the season as the Rapids were finishing up their playoff push. And he got 9 goals and 6 assists with the Rapids this season in MLS before getting injured. Was on the cusp of making the Olympic roster, but just didn't make the cut. I think he's a player who definitely deserves a second chance. I think a lot of people will remember him for his failed stint with Feyenoord and Fortuna Sittard in the Eredivisie, but he's still so young, just 23 years old. I think he's destined for a move back to Europe at some point and definitely good enough to make this roster. For the last one, this was definitely a difficult decision for me. I think there's a lot of intriguing options here, but I ended up going for Owen Wolff. Still just 20 years old, and he just turned 20 a few days ago, actually. His birthday is December 30th, so he's just 2 days away from being eligible for the U20s, which I think is crazy considering how many MLS minutes he has already. He's more or less a starter for Austin FC and can play at a variety of roles at the 6, at the 8, as a right midfielder, even as a left midfielder. He's so versatile. I think he is probably best in the center of the pitch, which is why I have him as a center mid here, but he provides versatility, and I think he's one of the youngest players in MLS who gets consistent minutes, so I think it's definitely worth giving him a chance. Former USA U20 as well. I think he's definitely deserving. A couple other players that are interesting, Benjamin Kromaski. I excluded him just because I think he will be with the U20s, and I think it's more important for him to stay with the U20s, as I mentioned previously for some other players like Peyton Miller. Rukas Pukstas is a very intriguing option here, an outside of the box one, because he does play in Europe, in Croatia, but he's destined for a transfer this window. It'd be so good for his career if he got it. It doesn't make any sense for him to stay. He should have got a transfer in the summer, and the Croatian season does kick off shortly after the USMNT window does start. However, if they want him to get a transfer, maybe letting him play in this camp would open some more eyes to him and some teams to potentially secure his services. So if he was released, I'd be more than happy to see him here. One option that I'm hoping isn't brought, but I'm fearing will be, is Alan Senora. As you'll see when I get to the attacking midfielders / wingers list, there's a little bit of a nepotism pick in there, just because Pochettino is Argentine. I'm hoping he doesn't also go with Alan Senora, who really hasn't been playing at all for Huracan in the Argentine league. I'm hoping Poch overlooks the Argentine connection there and doesn't pick him, but I'm also worried that he will be there. But mentioning that, let's move on to the attacking midfielders and talk about the guy who I just alluded to, Matko Miljevic, who was playing for Newell's Old Boys, of course, Messi's boyhood club, most notably known for, but also Mauricio Pochettino's boyhood club. He was playing for them this season in the Argentine League. Actually played okay as a midfielder in a variety of roles, as an 8, as a 10, as a left winger at times. The problem with him is his discipline concerns. He got his contract terminated by actual MLS, not even by the club, when he was playing for CF Montreal for using a fake name, playing in an indoor soccer league, which was illegal at the time, and for punching and spitting on a player while in that indoor soccer league. It was a bit of a joke of a situation. He went back to Argentina. He is a dual national, went to Newell's Old Boys, had a decent season, but just got released by them. Another club that he got his contract terminated by because of discipline concerns. It's really concerning. Honestly, I don't think he's at the quality to play for the USMNT even in this camp regardless, but when you consider the fact that it's a nepotism pick and his character concerns, honestly, it's ridiculous. I think if this was Greg Berhalter in charge, in all honesty, it would be talked about way more. It's already been confirmed by several reports that he will be in the camp. I would not have picked him personally, but I had to include him for the sake of realism here. Hopefully, he just doesn't get into any trouble. That's really all we can ask for him. For the other attacking midfielder spot, and you'll see a lot of the wingers that I have can also play attacking midfielder, but I went for Caden Clark from CF Montreal, the club that Matko Miljevic was kicked out of. The second Montreal player in this roster, which is interesting considering that they're a Canadian club. But Caden Clark, I think we all know that his adventure in Europe with RB Leipzig failed miserably, but he came back to MLS despite having a bit of a rough go of things with Minnesota United, his hometown club, got the transfer to CF Montreal midseason and was a completely different player there. 4 goals and 2 assists in 10 games, completely re-envisioned himself in the dual 10 role there with Bryce Duke, another American who could maybe make the cut for this camp. And I think it's worth it to see Caden Clark because he is still so young. He's still just 21, despite already going to Europe and coming back to MLS. He still has his whole career ahead of him. I think if he can continue some good form in MLS for another season or two, he'll go back to Europe at some point and hopefully succeed. I think it's worth it to give him a chance here in this camp since his form has been good to end the season. Now onto the wingers, and we'll go to the left wing because these 2 players who I picked for the left wing are essentially cams as well. We'll start with Diego Luna, who should be one of the marquee names in this camp. Excellent season for Real Salt Lake. 1 young player of the season in MLS, 9 goals and 8 assists in all competitions. Absolute no-brainer. I think it's criminal that he didn't get an Olympic spot over the summer, and it would be criminal as well if he wasn't used as the key player in this team because I think he's definitively the best and should make a move to Europe relatively soon, hopefully, if he knows what's best for his career, although there have been some links to Liga MX which kind of scare me. But alongside him, we have another dual national with Mexico, Brian Gutierrez, who was one of the only bright spots for the Chicago Fire last year. 6 goals, 4 assists in all competitions, playing mainly as a 10, but also as a left midfielder. So I have him and Luna as wingers because, like I said, Miljovic can also play as a left winger. Caden Clark could play as a winger if needed. He's done it in the past for the U.S. youth national teams. Owen Wolf even could play there. Julian Gressel. There's a lot of options on the wing, so I thought it made sense to bring the best players in terms of quality rather than positional fit, because it could have ended up being like Jordan Morris. So I think it's definitely fair to say that it's better to have Luna and Gutierrez, who are both so young and have so much potential, and we can keep them away from Mexico, which is an added bonus. Now, on the other side, for the right wingers, these guys are more traditional wingers. I'll start with Quinn Sullivan. He's been playing as an 8, and I think that role suits him very well for the Philadelphia Union. Had a breakout season, actually had the same number of goal contributions in MLS as Diego Luna did. A very, very good season for him. 7 goals and 10 assists in all competitions. Not in MLS, I meant, sorry, throughout the whole season. Breakout year for him, playing as an 8, but in the role that he plays, if you watch the Union, he drifts wide a lot, plays more as a winger. He's played as a winger for the U.S. youth national team in the past. I think it makes sense, considering the lack of options, to have him here as the starting right winger for this camp, considering the system that Poch does play. As the other right winger, I went for a very outside of the box one. I went for a player who is a U20, who is playing in Europe, and I think actually does have a chance of getting released for this camp. I went for Cole Campbell. I think he's the U20 who is the most ready to contribute to the U.S. men's national team right now, and I think this camp could be the perfect opportunity for him to get a look. Since Dortmund have had players returning from injury, they've shifted Campbell back to the second team on a consistent basis to try to get him playing time, which is why I think that they actually would not have much of a problem with releasing him for this camp, despite the fact that they do have games during the time. I think they could see the value in him playing for the USMNT under Poch for these 2 games. So I'm hoping that they do release him for this camp and that he is even invited, but we're just going to have to see. I hope he's there because he's probably the most talented player of the lot in terms of potential. But those are the wingers and attacking midfielders. Lots of versatility in there. And now finally on to the strikers. And we'll start with a player who just joined Austin FC in MLS, Brandon Vasquez. Now, he wouldn't have actually been in this camp if he didn't move, because Liga MX does start right before this camp does. So that's why Cade Cowell, Alejandro Zendejas are not in this team. They won't be released by their respective clubs because Liga MX will be underway. But since Vasquez made the transfer, I expect him to be leading the line in this camp. Of course, he's been part of the main USMNT under Pochettino, gotten a few chances, missed a few chances, but I expect him to still be here as the primary number 9. The second 9 option that I have here is Jesus Ferreira. Of course, just made the transfer marquee move to the Seattle Sounders. It'll be interesting to see what he does in the Club World Cup next year, because that's the only real competition he'll face, and it is real competition. PSG, Atletico Madrid, and Botafogo, probably the toughest group in the Club World Cup. As we said when we made a video predicting that, go watch that if you haven't. But I think it's definitely worth a chance to give him a chance with the USMNT. He's such a good player. He had his season in particular marred by injuries, but on his day, I think we know he's one of the best Americans in MLS. And it has to be said, for the national team, he does have a good goal scoring record, despite most of those goals coming against small island nations. This camp just seems perfect for a player like Jesus Ferreira, and I think he will be invited as one of the strikers. Now, for the final striker spot and for the final roster spot, I went for a very outside-of-the-box pick. I went for a dual national who would have to make a one-time switch to be called into this camp. No, it's not Damian Downs, although I don't think he'd even need a one-time switch. It's Maurice Malone from Austria Vienna in, of course, the Austrian League. I think he is a very intriguing option, has had a very good season for them in the Austrian Bundesliga. I believe 7 goals and 7 assists, having a very, very good start to the year for them, leading them towards the top of the table. It's 7 goals and 3 assists. Sorry, I got a little carried away on the goal contributions there, but he's a pure goal scorer, kind of like Haji Wright in the sense that he plays as a striker and a winger at times. In terms of profile, I think that's a decent matchup. And of course, Haji Wright being a USMNT player, Maurice Malone being better, I think, than some of the options we have. There's Patrick Adjamang from the Charlotte FC, but he is older by a little bit than Maurice Malone, or at least the same age. There's also like Jordan Morris, but let's be real, we don't want to see Jordan Morris with the USMNT ever again. I think it's worth taking a flyer on Maurice Malone, seeing what he can be. He's still relatively young, just 24 years old, coming off a decent half season in Austria. Also has previously played well in that division with Wolfsberger. So I think it's worth it. I don't know if he'll be convinced to make a one-time switch, but let's face it, he's never playing for Germany. So if we can get that, I think it's an intriguing option, especially since he can play as a winger, since, like I said, the wingers that I do have here are more of midfielders and can also play in that role. But with all of that done, that is my predicted roster, 26 men for the USMNT Camp Cupcake January camp, where we'll play Venezuela and Costa Rica. Let me know in the comments, what did you think of my roster prediction? Who would you bring? Are there any other players who you would want to see in this camp? Domestic based, maybe some players who you think could get released by their clubs in Europe. I think there's a lot of possibilities, not necessarily good possibilities, but possibilities nonetheless for this roster. So let me know who you would change, who you expect to see, and what players are you most excited to see? What prospects do you think have the most to gain from this camp that you think could have a USMNT future? I want to know what you guys think, so let me know in the comments. I'll definitely be interacting with all of you. But with that being said, have a great day, and let's look forward to another Camp Cupcake.